The railroads in the mid-19th century were really the most driving force in the American economy. They were the ones that generated the most capital. They became the model for big business. They became the first major transportation system inland. They were the first form of transportation to reach the Pacific coast in a reasonable amount of time. And they generated so many other sub-businesses that they literally were the dynamo of the economy all the way into the early 20th century. In the very early years, when the railroads were mostly local lines, most of the capital came from local merchants and others who were anxious to build a railroad from their town to a neighboring town. But later, when you got into larger projects, capital was needed and it had to be found at some major source. That major source became New York and the whole area that we now call Wall Street. It was partly, in large part, the railroads that created New York as the capital market for the United States. And from that point on, which was about the 1840s and forward, New York became the capital market from which railroads drew most of their capital. I should add, a good bit of that money that came through New York came from overseas as well, a lot of European capital. Capitalizing railroads was a difficult problem because nothing like it really existed before. There were corporations earlier, but they were mostly public corporations. Most American businesses were private, individually owned, partnership, very few even joint stock. But when the railroads came along, they were so big and required so much capital that some new way of doing it had to be devised. And that new way was the corporation. The corporation, as it existed originally, was something that was usually used for public works. So to create one for the private sector, there were a good number of difficulties in trying to get a system by which the corporation became a general form of organization. The California Gold Rush actually took place before railroads moved to the west. So they didn't play much of a role there. What they did do, or what the gold rush did, was to develop California. And when California developed, the desire to reach the West Coast grew even stronger because there were 2 or 3 states on the West Coast that were entirely unconnected to the rest of the United States. The railroads were probably the single most important influence in settling the western United States, all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. And they did this in part because where they went, settlers followed, towns developed, whole states eventually were organized. Until that happened, the West remained largely unsettled except for the Pacific coast. And when the railroads reached the Pacific coast, they literally tied the country together. There were 2 crises, actually, one in 1929 and one in 1930. In 1929, the stock market crashed. In 1930, the economy went into a recession. The origins of the 1929 crisis had to do with the stock market literally getting out of control as the economy developed. New businesses were formed. More people than ever had money that they could invest in stocks. And there just developed literally a runaway stock market. In most financial crises, the banks are kind of like the canaries in the coal mine. They warn when something is going to go wrong. And usually it is excesses or frauds or some sort of overextension of credit that leads to most American economic or financial failures. In 1929, this was very much true. Not only was the stock market out of control, but the banks were out of control. They were completely unregulated by government. They simply went their own way and they paid a big price. The stock market crash didn't really cause a world economic crisis. The stock market crash has happened, or similar crashes have happened, without their following a depression. In this case, however, by the fall of 1930, the economy slid into a depression for a number of reasons. And it was that depression which began to extend itself worldwide and began to affect other countries at different times and in different ways. Some European countries, most notably England, were already having financial problems well before this, and Germany as well. The most notable effects of Roosevelt's New Deal policy was one big one in particular, which is, for the first time, the American government got seriously involved in social welfare policies. For the first time, it provided things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, and other kinds of safety nets that an industrial economy almost everywhere else in the world, especially in Europe, already had, but the United States did not have. So what the New Deal did was literally introduce America to big government with all of its positives and negatives. The crisis of 1929 left deep scars, certainly left them on the stock market, because in terms of the market itself, it never climbed back to its 1929 level until the 1950s. In terms of overall, it wiped out a number of people. It made them darkly suspicious of investing in stocks. And when it brought on, it didn't bring on individually, but when the Depression came on, most people coupled the two events as one event and somehow saw the stock market as responsible for the Depression. As a result, it's very hard for people to separate those two things. And many of the policies that were devised by government to deal with those are still with us, or at least were with us until the 2000s. There are parallels between 1929 and the crisis after 2008. And some of those have to do with the fact that, once again, banks got out of control and pursued policies that should have been curbed before they grew as excessive as they did. And also, by undoing some of the policies, notably the Glass-Steagall Act, that had been put in place to prevent these sorts of things, the new generation of Americans had to learn anew what the failures of the system could be if you just let them run amok. Greed is an indelible part of the capitalist system, actually of any system, but it takes different forms. In our case, it's part of the fuel that drives a capitalist economy. And like anything else, if it gets out of control, then usually bad consequences occur. What happens, in other words, is that history doesn't repeat itself. History never repeats itself. But historical patterns do. And the historical patterns have to do with human behavior. And when human behavior becomes excessive, in this case greed, then you see what happens.